Okay, let's get started. Welcome everybody at a new Bytes of Innovation webinar. Bytes of Innovation is a webinar that is powered by Segmed, a company that provides medical imaging data for research purposes. At every Bytes of Innovation webinar, we invite a key opinion leader to talk about the future of healthcare. This show is co-hosted by Dr. Aline Lutz, who is the Vice President of Real-World Evidence and Clinical Insights at Segmed, and by myself, I'm Martin Willemink, co-founder and Chief Scientific Officer at Segmed. For the people in the audience, make sure to put your questions in the chat box so that we can discuss those after the presentation during the Q&A phase of this webinar. And today, I am very proud to announce that we have Dr. George Harston amongst us. George Harston is the Chief Medical and Innovation Officer at Brainomix, and he leads the translational medicine across the portfolio activities in stroke, pulmonary disease, and cancer. He graduated in medicine from the University of Cambridge and was later awarded a PhD or a DPhil from the University of Oxford, and that's where he continued his research and clinical activities actually. He's currently also part-time consultant physician in stroke and internal medicine at Oxford, and today George is going to talk about AI in imaging from development to adoption. George, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. I'm just going to share my screen. Perfect. Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today and share some of my thoughts really about what drives adoption of a medical technology and innovation, digital innovation, which I think is quite different from just getting a product to a regulatory clearance stage. So I'm trying to advance my slides.
We can see it.
Perfect. Great. Sorry about that. So thank you. As I said, I want to really talk about how you drive adoption of a clinical innovation, and in particular, I'm going to talk about stroke AI imaging software, which is increasingly becoming a standard of care in stroke treatment and management of stroke patients. And I want to give you a few insights into how we've gone along that journey and how the field, I think, as a whole, has got to the stage where really it is sort of widespread. There is widespread adoption and utilization. So first, a bit about us as a company, as one of Segmed's partners, Brainomix. So I work at Brainomix, as Martin introduced, as the Chief Medical and Innovation Officer, and oversee a variety of functions. And Brainomix, we deploy our software for both stroke and lung disease, fibrosing lung disease, globally. We have a large footprint in in Europe, mainland Europe, and the UK, and really a growing footprint in the US, with also activities in South America, Middle East, and China. So there's a lot of challenges that come with that, operating in different countries, not least regulatory considerations. So thinking about regulatory requirements in the different territories, and also handling a lot of data. So there's a lot of scans being processed, and we have to try and make sure that technology works consistently in all those sites. And to do that, we really have to work collaboratively with institutions. And we work not just with academic institutions to generate evidence, but also healthcare institutions for adoption and insight into our products. But also we work a lot with partners who are involved in the delivery of treatments. One of the things we see with our technology is that when it's used, treatments are adopted more rapidly, the right patients get the right management, and so we see a big opportunity, a big synergy working with partners in that space. So let's take a step back and just think about what we're aiming to do with imaging AI, which is what we do at Brainomix. Well, this gentleman here is really one of the pioneers when it came to medical imaging, Sir Godfrey Hounsfield, and he invented the CT scanner many years ago now, which is now essentially standard in almost all hospitals. And interestingly, he died of fibrosing lung disease, and he never benefited from his innovation, which I understand is one of his regrets toward the end of his life. And what's really gratifying is that we're now at a stage where we're using AI technology to inform treatment decisions for patients with fibrosing lung disease, the condition that Sir Godfrey Hounsfield had. And so we're now getting to the stage where we can link his innovation about sensing, about detecting, about measuring to treatments as well. And really, for me, that's the key of where the value of AI imaging lies. And so from my perspective, I think there's different ways you can add value in a patient pathway, but broadly speaking, you can think about identifying more patients for treatment. So identifying imaging biomarkers that might be an indicator of a treatment target. So for example, in stroke, it might be a large vessel occlusion that needs to be opened up. And so you can use imaging to identify that for treatment. You could select the right patients to be treated, patients who have capacity to benefit from an intervention, where the benefits of a treatment outweigh the risks. And imaging is often a key driver in that sort of decision making. And then you can also think about improving the efficiency of a system and making sure that patients get treated faster. Now, that might be on a sort of timescale of minutes in stroke, where every second counts, or it might be on a longer timescale. It might be in cancer or lung disease, where actually we know that starting treatments earlier, before a disease has progressed, before the injury is done, can help improve outcomes for patients and longer term function. And so you can break that down a bit, I guess, into this image of the way that imaging biomarkers in particular, might be used in a patient's care. You can screen, flag patients who might be at risk of a condition or have a suspected condition. You could use it for diagnosis. I think AI imaging biomarkers, there's some that are getting to sort of diagnostic quality, but I think standalone diagnosis is much harder at the moment, certainly using automated imaging. But really, we're definitely on the screening and triage stage. And that's not because actually diagnosis is never really just on a single modality. So obviously the clinical factors as well, not just the imaging. We need to think about how imaging biomarkers can affect treatment decisions. So for example, in stroke, how extensive is the injury to the brain? Does it need, will the patient benefit from a treatment or not? And then you can monitor treatment as well. So how effective is a treatment? And in our case, in lung disease, for example, we know that we can measure how well an antifibrotic is working, how fast the lung disease is progressing, and we use our imaging biomarkers to track that. And then post-treatment as well, thinking about prognostication, longer term outcomes as well, there's an opportunity for imaging biomarkers there as well. So those are all the different ways that you can add value to a patient, I guess, and to a healthcare system. And then to build that, you need to broadly speaking, to do these activities. This is a simplified flowchart, but critically, I think it starts with an unmet need. So you need to really understand what the value proposition of your technology is. What's the problem you're trying to solve? Because there's a lot of really neat technology out there that doesn't really have a home and doesn't therefore add value. And if it doesn't add value, it doesn't get used. So you need a clear unmet need where you can add value with your technology. And then you can use that to inform what the product looks like and what data is required to build that product. So we spend a lot of time thinking about data. What sort of data do we need? Who's it from? What sort of demographics? What's the generalizability? What characteristics, features does it need to build your product? But the data is not only used to build a product, to sort of feed, if you like, an AI algorithm, but also, probably more importantly, to demonstrate clinical validity. Clinical validation is central to the development of AI imaging products. In fact, probably more important than the development, the data for validation, because that validation data speaks to generalizability, it speaks to efficacy, it speaks to value add. Like a lot of drugs, it doesn't really matter how it works, but if it does work, then that's what gets adoption. And then once you sort of validated your technology, you know it's doing what you think it's doing, you can embed it in clinical trials, you can think about getting regulatory clearances, and through that clinical research activity and the regulatory clearance, only then can you get clinical adoption and sort of release it, if you like, into the wilds of prospective patient care. But you mustn't just let it go and stop monitoring it. We need to monitor the technology once it's being used by doctors and other clinicians, and track whether there's changes in the trends of healthcare practice, if there's changes in the data that's being processed by your technology, and make sure that it continues to operate and perform as you designed it. So let's talk about stroke specifically. How is AI imaging technology used in stroke? Well, key in stroke is there's a very clear unmet need. Once a stroke starts, the clock is ticking. Time is brain is the adage in stroke care. And so we know that for every, different ways of modeling this, but, people say things like for every hour, the brain gets 3.6 years of aging. It doesn't mean a huge amount, but time is clearly critical. Every minute with a large vessel occlusion stroke, you lose on average 2 million neurons, and then that equates to a real functional outcome for a patient. It might be the difference between being in a long-term institution and being at home independent. And lots of patients miss out on treatment. Depends a bit on your healthcare system, but all healthcare systems underserve their patients to a greater or lesser degree, and patients consistently miss out on the right treatment. And if they do get the right treatment, often will get it too late. So for those of you not familiar with stroke, what does the workflow look like? Well, stroke is a slightly, it's a challenging condition to diagnose and treat because it happens so quickly. Somebody turns up with a suspected stroke. Now, depending on your healthcare system, about half of those patients won't actually have a stroke at all. And then the rest of them will have a variety of different problems which fall under the stroke umbrella. And most patients, the first thing that happens to them is they get a CT scan. It's a 3D X-ray of the brain. And with that, you can identify if there's any bleeding in the brain. And that counts for about 15% of patients. And then you can also see how much injury there is if it's not a bleeding type stroke. If it's the 85% of the so-called ischemic strokes, you can quantify how much injury there is to the brain. And that's helpful for determining what the right treatment is. Hopefully, most places that are reasonably well performing are now doing a CT angiogram, a CTA, at the same time, where you inject contrast into the veins, wait till it gets to the blood vessels supplying the brain, and take the CT scan. And that way you can identify if there's a blockage to a blood vessel or and how good the collaterals are. So how good the compensatory blood flow to the brain is. And for most patients, that's enough information to make a decision about whether or not they need something called thrombolysis, which is clot busting treatment to break down a blood clot and restore blood to the brain, or thrombectomy, which is a minimally invasive surgical procedure to do exactly the same, to remove the clot and restore blood to the brain. And for some patients, we get advanced imaging, so CT perfusion or MRI, and that depends on certain clinical factors, but that also requires processing, and then that can identify patients who might be amenable for treatment, and then we follow up with a scan at 24 hours. And so it's exactly on that imaging workflow that we need to design our product to help patients. So in Brainomix, we developed something called Brainomix 360 Stroke. And what it does is it takes the non-contrast CT scan, it takes the CT angiogram and the CT perfusion, and it processes them all at the same time to produce a result that quantifies the injury, identifies the treatment targets, it quantifies how much brain is at risk, and it presents it to clinicians wherever they are. So, and within a meaningful time frame as well. So typically within sort of 1 to 2 minutes, I've got the results of, for example, the CT scan, not only on the hospital imaging system, the PACS, but also on a web user interface and most usefully on my mobile phone. So I can get alerts on my phone, a scan's been processed, and I can see the results, how much injury, etc. there is. And all of that feeds then into my decision making about how to treat a patient. And critically, it can't just be an algorithm. It's got to be a product that sits in a patient pathway. And so we put the technology, we need to configure it so the CT scanner sends the right images to the server that they get processed and then output where they need to be in a seamless way. And we spend a lot of time trying to work with sites, and this is not an easy thing to do, but to make sure the workflow is optimized and make sure the results are really accessible for the clinicians wherever they are. And nowadays, we actually do that across a network of hospitals. So not just in an individual hospital, we also have to make sure the technology is accessible across a network so that non-specialist centres can, their images can be seen in real time by specialist centres as well as locally to make decisions about transfer for this minimally invasive surgical procedure called thrombectomy. So here's a case study. This is from a patient that I treated recently, actually earlier this year. So this was a 70-year-old lady who presented to one of our nearby hospitals, about an hour and a half away, in Reading, at about 9 o'clock in the evening. And she'd had a 2-hour history of some left-sided weakness and inattention. So she wasn't paying attention on that side of her body. And her NIHSS, which is the score of how severe her neurology was 13. So that's likely to be a pretty disabling stroke. And she was very well beforehand. That's what the pre-morbid MRS means, 0. Now, she'd had a stroke in the past, and so you could see the old stroke, and actually it was in the same area that her new stroke was, but she had made a full recovery from that and was on appropriate medication, but she now had a new problem in the same region. And what the emergency team saw in Reading, so these are non-specialist doctors, is immediately they can see the scan of the CT scan, which shows how much injury there is to the brain. And you can see there's this thing called the aspect score, which is a 10-point or 11-point scale of how many regions are affected. And you can see there's a couple here that have been identified. So it's not too bad. There's a lot to play for. And you can see here that, again, a blood vessel is blocked off. And there's a circle showing you, that's the AI algorithm showing you where the blockage is. And downstream, you can see there's a lack of blood flow. So this is very easy scanning to do, but quite hard to interpret. And this is where the AI adds value. So even your non-specialist clinicians can quickly identify there's a problem, what the problem is, and what the likely treatment is that needs to be given. So this patient was given a clot-busting drug, something called tenecteplase, which is the thrombolysis drug, and gratifyingly, she made a recovery. So her stroke scale went from 13 down to 3. So that's really good improvement, very minimal residual symptoms. And so she wasn't transferred because the treatment appeared to have worked. However, the next day, she then deteriorated again. So she was on the stroke ward in Reading, and then she suddenly developed a new dense left-sided weakness, very disabling. And her score went up from 3 to 15, and they rescanned her. And here you can see she's got an occlusion again, possibly the same one, but actually I think it probably is a new occlusion. She's got a particular problem in that vessel, and actually gave her clot-busting treatment again, and then they discussed her with me. So I asked them to transfer her across for specialist care. And again, she was improving. So now she's got a score of 5. So she's been yo-yoing a bit up and down with her different treatments, but her score is now 5. So she's doing clinically better, and it's a bit lower than we'd normally have as our threshold to treat her. But actually, by doing the scans, I was able to identify that actually there's quite a lot of brain at risk. You can see this green area here. So it's brain that's at risk, but not yet dead. And so therefore, given the ongoing blockage of the blood vessel, we made a decision to treat her. And so she went on and did very well. So by 24 hours, she had no symptoms and minimal new injury on her follow-up CT scan. So you can see here how the imaging biomarkers and the AI imaging analytics is really adding value to that patient pathway. And critically, the product is designed to address the biggest unmet needs in the pathway. So we design the product around simple imaging, so-called simple imaging, non-contrast CT, CT angiography, which is what's available in every hospital, so even non-specialist centres. And about 80% of stroke patients will go to a non-specialist centre first off. So you need to build your product for them. But also it's able to do the advanced imaging, the CT perfusion in a specialist centre to make those more nuanced decisions. And really that's critical for AI imaging technology around adoption, is you have to address the unmet need and clearly add value to the network. It's not about a sensitivity and specificity. It's not about an area under the curve or an area under the ROC curve. That doesn't really matter. It's about value. That's how you drive adoption, which is what we're going to talk about now. So this is really where I focus a lot of my time, is thinking about how do we not only validate the software, check that the sensitivity and specificity and what have you is correct, but also how do you demonstrate it's valuable and a driver of adoption. And for me, this is very much a ladder of evidence. So you need to start off with a strong foundation. So you need to say that, when you measure something, you're measuring, your result is telling you what you think it's telling you. And I will go through some examples in a moment. So these are very imaging focused studies. You then need to show it's clinically meaningful, so-called prognostic markers. You need to think about whether it can be used to select patients to treatment. Can you put it in trials? And then ultimately, can you add value to a system of care? So health economic evaluations really, for me, are the pinnacle of evidence generation, showing that society benefits because patients do better when you use a technology. And for those evaluations, those validations, you need different endpoints. So imaging endpoints for your sort of foundation, but you soon need to move to clinical endpoints and then healthcare system endpoints ultimately. So let's talk through some of these sort of bits of evidence. So validations, can you trust the results? And this is very common in regulatory studies or in sort of research. Often radiologists like to do this sort of stuff. You could say, actually, if I measure using my AI imaging biomarker, can I measure the same, as a radiologist or what have you? And so we do that quite a lot. It's sort of useful for benchmarking and checking performance is consistent over time, but it's not really how the software is supposed to be used. it's supposed to be used as a decision support tool. So how does it impact the performance of a radiologist or another physician in making a decision? And here you can see in red the unaided performance, and this is a kappa, so a measure of how well against the ground truth these doctors are scoring. And you can see that more experienced and more specialist doctors do better, but everyone does better with the AI, and the biggest gains are in the less specialist doctors, and that's what we want to see. So that's the point of the technology. And then you need to say, well, how do I interpret the results? What do they mean in practice? And so you might do some prospective testing. And again, you're still thinking about sensitivity and specificity, but now you might add in positive and negative predictive value. So you might think about, how does it work in a real world system? You've sometimes got noisy data, but critically, you've got a representative prevalence of your condition in your population. And that's important because that, as I said, gives you the positive and negative predictive value, which tells you really when you look at an individual result of an individual patient, how much can you rely on that, or how can you interpret that? Because that is clearly critical to know. Whereas sensitivity and specificity is a population-based metric and doesn't really tell you about the individual patient. Having done all that, you're confident how it works. You then need to demonstrate value. How do we demonstrate value? Well, we put it in the real world and we measure the impact on patient care and patient outcomes. And so here you can see some evidence from different studies we've done. We've looked at access to the number of patients being treated when the technology is being used, again, in representative healthcare systems. And then you can see that if more patients are treated, that you get better patient outcomes. You might look at surrogates of performance, so things like time to treatment. So we can show, for example, in multiple studies now that we can save up to about an hour off the patient, what's called door in, door out time. So the time it takes from a patient to arrive at hospital, to leave that hospital, to get the definitive care at a specialist centre. That's quite a common finding we find. And then if you do that, you can then see the impact it has on patient outcomes, improved functional outcomes, patients less likely to be disabled a few months after their stroke. And then critically, we want to show that's generalizable across a whole network of hospitals. And I just want to touch on that just in the last few minutes about how we validated this, specifically in the NHS, but also we've done this in other healthcare systems as well. But I think really this is our flagship study, which was published in the Lancet Digital Health last year. So the story of stroke AI imaging in the NHS really started back at the beginning of the decade. There was a really strong vision from the clinical leadership in the NHS that AI could add value to the patient pathway in the UK. There was a clear unmet need. Patients were missing out on treatments. And that belief was based on evidence from other countries, but actually we didn't have strong evidence in the UK. But really helpfully, the clinical leadership in the UK published something called the NOSIP, the National Optimum Stroke Imaging Pathway, back in 2021, where they expressed, they rubber stamped, if you like, the use of AI in patient care to help improve outcomes. And around that time, we were granted we were given a grant, the NHS AI and Health and Care Award back in 2020. And so we evaluated our technology across a few different stroke networks, 26 hospitals in total, and we deployed the technology over a period of a few months. And we looked at those hospitals, what happened to performance in those hospitals over that time and afterwards, and then also what happened to the performance of the hospitals that weren't part of the evaluation. It was all done independently by the Oxford, then it was called the Academic Health Science Network. It's now called the Health Innovation Oxford and Thames Valley. And it was a prospective evaluation. And critically, it was a real world evaluation. It wasn't, we didn't exclude any patients. It was all patients. It was pragmatic and a mixed methods design. And so the key outcome measures we looked at in these 26 hospitals over actually in the end of 5-year period was the number of patients getting access to care, and then also the efficiency, the time it took to get them treated, particularly when they came to a non-specialist hospital first of all. And we looked at both within the hospitals that had the technology before and after, and then comparing the hospitals that did and didn't have the technology. So in the end, we ended up getting data from nearly 500,000 patients across the whole of England as part of the evaluation. And within that subgroup, 26 hospitals, there was 70,000 patients with ischemic stroke in those 26 hospitals. And if we look at the access to thrombectomy, you can see that they start off both, at an unsatisfactory baseline, but actually there's a clear improvement in the intervention arm, whereas actually in the remaining hospitals in England, you don't see that big increase. There is some increase, and that reflects ongoing improvement to access to care. Some sites also started to use AI in this period as well, outside of the intervention group, but you can see this clear differentiation by the end of the evaluation after the installation period, and a highly significant impact on number of patients getting treated. And then, so that was one way of looking at it. And then the other way was to look in the hospitals where we put the technology. Not every patient did they use the AI, but when they did, they were more likely to get thrombectomy. And that's even adjusting for a whole load of clinical variables. They were also more likely to get thrombolysis. And gratifyingly, it was associated with improved patient outcomes. The other thing we looked at was the efficiency of care. And so for patients who are being transferred for thrombectomy, we saw that a really marked time saving of over an hour when the AI was used compared to when the AI wasn't used. So within the same hospitals, we saw this quite dramatic difference, and really validating the value proposition that not only are more patients being treated, but they're being identified in a more efficient and effective way. So key outcomes of this study really was that a significant impact on the number of patients getting the standard of care, a reduction in the time it took them to get that care, and that combination was associated with improved patient outcomes. We also saw improved access to the drug treatment, thrombolysis, and ultimately improved patient outcomes. And really, what was very interesting was that the biggest impact was in non-specialist hospitals. All hospitals benefited as a group, but actually those with the less specialist physicians benefited the most. But that wasn't enough to get adoption. So adoption's more than just sort of clinical evidence. It's also about broader public awareness. The people who make decisions about funding are not academics. They are politicians, they're ministers. And so actually, you've got to tell a story. Now, the story needs to be based on evidence, and we generated that. But actually, we were really fortunate to have a very strong marketing activity, public awareness activity that really sort of was captured. The imagination of these bodies, these outlets, was captured by the evidence, and so we were able to see a really compelling argument more broadly outside of the academic spheres of what the opportunity was for AI in healthcare to improve patient outcomes. And then we took the results and we looked at the health economic impact as well. And really importantly, in stroke, if you treat more patients, they do better, and then you reduce the impact on society. There's less care needs, there's healthcare needs, and there's less indirect care costs as well. So partners of people who've had a stroke don't need to stop working to care for their loved ones. They're able to keep working and contribute to the broader economy. So it's a real win-win treating stroke patients. And we saw a very dramatically positive cost economic analysis on the back of this study. So perhaps I'll just wrap up there and really have to take any questions. But just to conclude, I think AI in medical imaging is increasingly becoming a standard of care. I think stroke's been a real in the vanguard of adoption of AI imaging technology because of the unmet need. Critically, I think the biggest value has been, and the opportunity is in making sure that you cover all healthcare systems. Inevitably, there's a trend for specialist academic centres to adopt new interesting technology and kit early. But actually, if you want to have an impact and add value, you've got to do it across whole healthcare systems. And I think one of the other reasons that stroke has been such a successful exemplar is that the patient really, there's a big unmet need, and they're at the centre of the solutions value proposition. The patient then, and the unmet need of the patient informs the development, creates these tools which speak to simple imaging. It creates the network deployment. It creates the treatment-focused biomarkers that are outputs that then lead to adoption and clinical impact. But I guess this is just a start for AI. I think there are really exciting opportunities to integrate more clinical data into decision making, to have more clinical outputs. At the moment, we have imaging in, imaging out in terms of regulatory frameworks. I think having more clinical in and clinical out is going to be very exciting. And as these technologies develop, I don't think there's going to be a massive step change, but I think they'll evolve and increasingly add value to healthcare systems to support that we care for patients. So I will stop sharing there, and as I said, really happy to have any discussions, any questions to discuss that in more detail.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for the presentation, George. Very insightful. So I'll kick us off with a Q&A. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. If anyone else have questions, please drop your questions in the chat. So my first question, so I see you started working early with the NHS through a grant that you received early on. So for those companies that do not have such a trajectory, how do you see the NHS being open to testing and potentially implementing new technologies and solutions?
Yeah, the NHS is a difficult set of institutions to work with sometimes. So interesting, our early adopting sites were actually in mainland Europe. That's where we had the early traction. But as a UK-based company, we're obviously very invested in the UK and wanted to deploy our software here, and it's a great market, the UK. But so once we had those proof points and people started to see the opportunity that was being afforded in other countries, then we got the clinical leadership, and then we got into the NHS. That was really it really took off. But once it took off, it is now, I think, all stroke hospitals in England have AI imaging technology, also in Wales. So if you can get the national leadership in the NHS to buy in, identify the resources that are needed to support adoption, then I think it could be a fantastic place to deploy. It's not without its challenges. It's not the homogenous institution that it's often perceived as. It's a whole set of individual hospitals, individual businesses with their own processes and procedures. But there is something about the national leadership that can actually drive change at pace once it gets going. But it can be difficult to start with, and it can have it's not straightforward. But it is but once it goes, it can really adopt technology pretty well.
So you emphasized the importance of developing a solution that really adds value to the patient care. So how do you see, and your product is focused on stroke, so how do you see solutions that are for acute care versus kind of non-acute care? Do you see value for those as well?
Yes, I do. I would say we work in both acute, so stroke, but we also work in non-acute conditions, so fibrosing lung disease. We have another product in that e-lung, and the problems are similar actually, but on a different time scale. So in our lung disease product, we look at identifying patients with fibrosing lung disease and getting them access to antifibrotic treatment sooner. And what we've shown is that in stroke, we've shown that we can improve access to care by an hour. In lung disease, we've shown that it can be by over a year that improves access to care. So it's the same problem, it's just a different time scale. And there are clearly more nuanced differences than that. But actually, if you're very reductionist about it, it is actually patients miss out on treatment or they get it too late. And those are big problems in both acute and chronic care. And I think we see that in a whole variety of systems. We don't work in the field, but lung nodule detection is all about identifying patients early, about getting patients treatment earlier before their sort of cancer's more progressed. Breast cancer screening. There's a whole load of opportunities where AI imaging analysis is able to support the earlier and more sensitive identification of patients with a particular condition, so they can get treated quicker. There's clearly some value in products which improve, for example, the efficiency of radiologists who are doing their reporting. But for us, it's never really been about that. It's about adding value to the patient and improving the access to care. And then, if you get radial efficiency as a sort of secondary outcome, that's great. But actually, I think there's clear, unambiguous value in just making sure that you can get more patients treated with the right treatment sooner.
Yeah, great. It makes sense. And also, I'm sure, being in the UK, I'm sure you were more exposed to all the cost evaluation that you also mentioned, evaluating qualities against cost. So that's a super important lens to have, and that is certainly emphasized in the UK.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we spend a lot of time thinking about that. One of the interesting things is that, the UK obviously has a framework for thinking about health economics and a well-established system, and it's got NICE and what have you. I'm sure many people are familiar with, but actually, it's not really. A lot of these systems are not ready for digital imaging technologies because they're new, they're much more agile, they're much quicker happening. They're built for, these systems are built for drugs. So it's been quite interesting working with these bodies and working with the procurement teams to change the ways of thinking about how technology can add value and how it needs to be validated.
Got it. Very interesting. We've got the first question from somebody in the audience. Sinat is asking, given the recent developments in AI and agentic systems and so on, where do you see the future heading? Very broad question.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think quite a lot about this. To my mind, so AI is all about handling and interpreting data. That's, to me, the real value that AI has. And in imaging fields, and I mean that broadly, so not just radiology imaging, but of course ophthalmology, pathology, it's fairly straightforward to get the data in compared to some other variables that you might want. If you have to get data from an EMR or from physiology data, it's much less structured, whereas actually imaging is quite good. So I think that's why we've seen imaging really be the sort of first area where AI has been adopted. But actually, as it gets more sophisticated and systems get better organized, I think there's an opportunity for more clinical data, more different, if you like, modalities of data to be included, and that opens the door for sort of multimodal data synthesis. So, for example, in stroke, let's say, you might have not only imaging data, you might have clinical data come in, you might have physiological data, you might have other sort of demographic variables, whatever it is. You can have all of this data coming into your algorithms, and then the other, so I think that's the data input sort of development, and then the outputs as well. So you have to enact what you do with your AI algorithm outputs. What does that look like? And at the moment, it's about everything, or most AI is benchmarked against an imaging standard, often by a consensus of experts or whatever it is. But actually, the opportunity is much more exciting. You could do something better than experts. You could start benchmarking against clinical outcomes and treatment decisions. And so you start to have a flow of data in, then the AI analytics data out, which is much more sophisticated, multimodal data in, complex analytics, and then an output which doesn't just tell you, oh, this is the imaging score. It tells you actually this is the treatment recommendation based on all that information. And so I think in parallel to AI development and agentic AI and generative AI and all these other sort of fantastic computer stuff that's going on, it's worth nothing unless you've got the data in and the way to affect it. So I think just as exciting is the development of sensing technology. So for example, I saw a really neat demonstration of a virtual neurological examination recently using those sort of virtual reality lenses. So not only can you guide a patient what to do, you can also record their movements, track their arm movements, track the motor function, and their speech and all this other stuff. So you can start to objectively and in a structured way collect that data. And at the other end, to do stuff with it, you can give it to physicians, clinicians, but you can also then start thinking about robotics. So how do you actually get your robotic outputs as well to the next? So for me, I think that's the way I think about the next generation development. It's how do we get from where we are now, which is just about AI and imaging data, to getting really complex data in, really neat AI, and then affecting the change and having an impact on patients.
Got it. Actually, the next question from the audience is in line with this. Safuris Apostolos says, great talk. When you said at the end about incorporating more clinical data into the decision process, are you referring to automatic extraction from EHR or on-site data? So I guess this refers to the multimodal component. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, hi, yes, first. I think it's an important point, and I guess it depends on the clinical context. So for some stuff, you might want sensor data, that physiology. Let's say you're in an intensive care setting, you might want to have, and you want to predict clinical decline. You may want real-time tracking of respiratory rates, blood pressure, heart rate, and all that sort of stuff. So I guess that's sensing, and you need data input for that. But actually, for other conditions, you might think about using, the EMR and using AI algorithms to extract, so let's say long-term chronic conditions. If you want to identify patients at risk of dementia, you might want to be using data that's input into healthcare record and extracted from the EMR over many years to predict, for example, cognitive decline. So you can imagine that if you have this sort of pattern of healthcare engagements plus the imaging factors plus sort of physiological variables, you could see that actually all of that data might feed into an algorithm that might identify patients, for example, who are at risk of cognitive decline and might benefit from early intervention. So I think it depends on the use case. One of the things I think is really interesting is the balance between sort of general AI opportunities as opposed to indication specific. So I think one of the easiest, I think for us, one of the key to success is to really focus on an indication where all the stakeholders are aligned and want to improve a particular problem. I think there are some thoughts that you have a sort of general models that do all things to all people, these foundation models. I'm not sure, I don't know if they're going to be the right way that things get adopted, because I think it's all about value and demonstrating clear value. And for me, if you think about a particular problem, then that seems much easier to get adopted, because you can demonstrate the value, you can demonstrate the return on investment and get that clinical uptake.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion indeed. Are the broad models going to be the future, or are the more narrow, specific AI models going to be the future? Yeah. Okay, we have about 2 more minutes. I wanted to ask you one last question and then round it up. It's of course important that the model performs well. The algorithm performance is very important.
Yes.
But if you have a great model, but the user experience is terrible, then likely it won't do much in clinical practice. How important is that balance, you think? And I know you guys have, you have an app and you really have worked on that user experience, but can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, no, you're completely right, and you've expressed it far more clearly than I could. You do need both that good algorithm that people can trust and know how it performs, but you do need it to embed into a clinical workflow and a pathway that means people use it. So the best way to do that is to make it appealing and intuitive for clinicians. The classic, Apple has a great reputation for making their phones and technology really easy to use. My parents' generation can all use their phones and stuff because it's so intuitive and easy to use, and clinicians are the same. You do really need to focus on that. The difference between a satisfied and unsatisfied customer is not going to be a few percentage points on an area under the receiver operating characteristic curve. It's going to be about how intuitive it is to use the user interface. Can they log in when they want it? Can they get the results when they need it? Is it in a form that's easy to navigate? So it's probably just as important, if not more important, the user experience. In fact, there are some other technologies that are used in stroke, which I think probably have less robust, deep algorithms, but people just like them because they have a nice app and you can look at the images really easily. And so, there's clearly value in just having a nice interface and a nice app. We don't subscribe to that. We want to add extra value, but there's clearly a value in just in that.
Awesome. Well, George, thank you very much. This was a very insightful presentation. We learned about how to go from development of AI models to actual clinical adoption. A really important topic. So thanks, George, for this excellent presentation. I also would like to thank my co-moderator, Aline, for being here, and also Andrea behind the scenes, who is organizing this whole webinar. And of course, the audience for attending this webinar and for the interactions we've had. The next Bytes of Innovation webinar will be in exactly 2 weeks, Tuesday, April 28th, where we will have Denise Mead, who is the Vice President of Life Sciences and MedTech at Verily, where she's going to talk about our partnership and also what Verily is doing in the real-world data and real-world evidence space. So thanks again, George, and thanks to the audience, and I hope to see you all in 2 weeks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you.